I always thought betrayal would come from outside. A stranger on the street, a competitor in business, maybe even a distant relative with greedy hands. I never expected it to be waiting for me under my own roof, hidden behind the smile of the woman I loved and the handshake of the man I trusted most. The moment it hit me is burned into my mind. It was late on a Tuesday night. I'd worked a long day, came home to an empty house, and something in me said check her phone. She had left it on the kitchen counter, glowing with a new message. I wasn't snooping, I swear I wasn't. But when I saw his name flash on the screen, Ethan, my stomach dropped. Ethan, my best friend. Ethan, the guy who stood next to me as best man at my wedding. The message was simple. Just 3 words. But they shattered everything. Can't wait. Tonight. That was the moment my marriage, my friendship, and the last 10 years of my life cracked like glass under a hammer. My name is David Lawson, and this is the story of how my wife and my best friend tried to ruin me, and how I made sure they paid for every kiss, every lie, and every dollar they tried to steal. To understand what happened, you need to know the foundation. Because betrayal only hurts this much when you've given everything to the people who betray you. I met Claire when I was 26. I wasn't rich, but I was ambitious. I had a decent job in IT, some savings, and a hunger to build something lasting. Claire was stunning, bright smile, sharp mind, the kind of woman who walked into a room and bent the air around her. I fell hard, fast. We married 2 years later. I bought us a modest house, worked long nights to make sure we had more than just the basics. When she said she wanted to go back to school, I covered the tuition. When she wanted to try launching her own boutique business, I wrote the checks. I wasn't just her husband, I was her biggest investor, her safety net, her #1 fan. And Ethan? He'd been my friend since high school. We'd scraped through bad jobs together, partied in the same cheap bars, pulled each other out of trouble more times than I can count. When Claire and I got married, he was the first guy I asked to stand by me at the altar. He wasn't just a friend, he was a brother. So when I tell you the shock nearly put me on the floor, I mean it. Seeing his name light up on her phone, knowing what those words meant, it felt like I was suddenly a stranger in my own life. But betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. And if you want revenge, real revenge, you have to listen quietly before you move. I didn't confront Claire that night. I didn't storm into our bedroom and demand answers. I did what I'd trained myself to do in business negotiations. I kept calm, I observed, and I started to plan. The next morning, she kissed me goodbye like nothing was wrong. She had no idea I knew. And Ethan? He texted me later that day asking if I wanted to grab a beer on Friday. Like nothing had changed. Like he wasn't stabbing me in the back every chance he got. I smiled through the pain. I let them both think I was blind. Because if they thought they could deceive me so easily, I wanted to see how far they'd go. The cracks widened quickly. I noticed Claire dressing up more when she said she was going to the gym. I noticed Ethan showing up at odd times, always with flimsy excuses. And then there were the finances. Small amounts at first, withdrawals from our joint account, charges I didn't recognize. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. Business expenses, she said. But when I looked closer, the pattern was there. She wasn't just betraying me in bed, she was draining me dry. I began documenting everything. Screenshots of her texts, bank statements, credit card charges. I created a folder on my laptop labeled Receipts. Every lie, every little theft, went in there. Because I wasn't going to just catch them. I was going to bury them. The worst part wasn't the cheating. Not really. It was the conversations I overheard, the little things they let slip when they thought I wasn't listening. Plans about starting over, talk about how much money they'd need to really make it work. My wife. My best friend. Plotting a future together, with my money. That was when the rage turned to something sharper. Cold. Calculated. I didn't want to just expose them. I wanted them to choke on the consequences. But here's where I'll pause. Because the next step I took, the way I made sure their greed became their undoing, that's where this story shifts from heartbreak to revenge. Backhand index pointing right. Tell me this, if you found out your spouse and your best friend were betraying you, would you confront them immediately, or would you play dumb and set the trap? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because part 2 is where things start to burn. They say people show you who they are when they think you're not watching. I watched. I watched every careless step and saved it like a ledger. The cheating hurt, of course it did, but the money was the thing that turned my grief into something with teeth. You can forgive a kiss. You can't forgive a ledger that reads like theft. After that night with the flashing message, I started from the part of betrayal that most people ignore, the numbers. Claire had always been clever about money. She could spin a story that made an expense sound like a strategy. Advertising, she'd say with a tilt of her head, or inventory, and somewhere I'd nod and write the check. I'd thought that was partnership. I'd thought that was trust. What I didn't realize was that she and Ethan had learned to use the language of trust as a loophole. The first thing I did was open a new email account, a disposable throwaway that looked like nothing. I used it just to sign up to our bank alerts under a secondary name. I didn't want to alert her that I was watching. If you move too fast you scare people, if you move too slow they adapt. I needed slow. Then I began to comb our accounts. At first it was tiny things, a dinner charge at a restaurant I had never heard of, a boutique hotel reservation that vanished the next morning, a series of cash withdrawals at an ATM 2 towns over. Small, plausible. But what made me sick was the cadence. These charges appeared right after Claire and Ethan had gone out together. They were spending my money on things I'd never be part of, then splitting it or using it to pay for the trappings of a life they planned to share without me. I downloaded every statement for the last 2 years. I printed them. The physicality of paper makes theft more real. On the kitchen table, under the hum of the refrigerator, I spread the documents like playing cards and started to sort. Dates, amounts, merchant names. The pattern turned into a picture, transfers from my accounts to a shifting set of vendors, payments to companies that on the surface looked legitimate but, when you looked closer, pointed to shell services, consultants, and one P.O. box that kept appearing. I needed help I could trust. I called Aaron, a friend from college who now ran a small forensic accounting practice. He owed me a favor from the time I covered his rent when he got sick. He came over one evening and looked at the files with a tired sort of pity. "You didn't deserve this," he said, not trying to be dramatic. He just said it and then got to work. Aaron traced the flow. Money moved from the joint account into a marketing vendor account. From there, a portion would be wired to a car dealership, a piece to a luxury store, and small amounts to an anonymous credit card used at a boutique hotel chain. The vendor names changed like clothes, but the routing numbers and the P.O. box were consistent. That P.O. box traced back to a mail receiving service on the edge of the city. Men signed for packages there, phones answered vaguely, and the billing was billed to a name I didn't recognize. When we dug into that name, an interesting thing happened. The company registration kicked up a list of names that overlapped with emails Claire had used for her boutique business. One of the directors was listed as an operations consultant with a last name that matched Ethan's middle name. Coincidence? Maybe. A pattern? Definitely. We made copies of everything and stored them in 2 places, a locked desk drawer and an encrypted cloud account under a name Claire would never think to check. If you're going to collect evidence, you make it indestructible. Next, I needed to know more about Ethan. I'd known him for 20 years, but you can live 2 lives with one man. I started to audit his social footprint. Old friends on social media posted photos of him and Claire in places he'd never taken me to. They posted selfies in rooms I'd never been invited to. Comments from accounts I didn't recognize gushed about plans and moving forward. I hired a private investigator, because there are things a man with a laptop and a grudge shouldn't do alone. I trusted Laura, a professional with a soft voice and a sharp phone. She trailed Ethan for a price and returned with receipts and photos. There was the 2-night trip to the coast billed to a card that had been topped up from the company account. There was a receipt from a jeweler with a deposit that matched a transfer I'd seen in the ledger. The PI's report was clinical and cold, and it snapped the emotional parts into harsh lines. But evidence alone isn't enough if you don't have narrative. People can claim errors, mix-ups, misunderstandings. So I built a story around the numbers, a chronology that showed intent. Day after day, week after week, expense after expense. There was a crescendo, months in which the transfers increased, where a company supposed to be supporting Claire's business suddenly had flows that exceeded reasonable marketing budgets and doubled as personal payroll. The numbers began to look criminal, not careless. At the same time, I had to manage appearances. It's one thing to know your life is being stolen. It's another to act like a fool and let the thieves think they've won. I played it carefully. I was the husband who'd noticed nothing, the one who asked gentle questions and let the explanations come. I let Claire feel safe. I let Ethan think he was clever. The less they suspected, the more careless they became. There were nights I went to the kitchen and held my head in my hands. I'd stare at the photographs on the mantel, our wedding, the first housewarming, the graduate cards I'd paid for, and try not to let the hurt be the thing that drove me. A man can fall into cruelty if he lets hatred be the gasoline. I wanted my revenge to be surgical, not a bonfire. So I kept gathering. I started to record conversations on my phone, legally permitted in our state as long as one party, me, consented. Sometimes, Claire and Ethan would speak openly in the living room, believing I was out grabbing groceries. Sometimes they'd leave voicemails that were dumb with affection. I archived each one. The recordings were the kind of thing that, when combined with bank transfers and receipts, create a narrative harder to spin away. There were moments when the plan almost broke. Claire would call me into her office to talk about family finances, and I'd sit and listen to how she framed the expenditures as business growth. She'd present a marketing strategy with a slide one could almost believe was real, mock-ups, aspirational language, a few reports that looked like they'd been created by a professional. It was convincing, except that the numbers didn't line up. At one meeting, I asked when we'd expect a return on the new website investment. She fumbled through her notes, then smiled and said, "Soon. Very soon." If I'd exploded with rage, if I'd stormed out, the story might have become a domestic scene, petty and messy. Instead I nodded, took mental notes, and asked for the invoices to be emailed so I could forward them to accounting. She obliged. That email became another piece of evidence. On top of the financial work, I had to think about legal strategy. Aaron introduced me to a family attorney named Priya, calm, exacting, and not remotely interested in drama. Priya outlined the options: immediate confrontation and divorce filings, or patient evidence gathering followed by a simultaneous civil and criminal presentation that would hit both their privilege and their pockets. She recommended the latter. If you go in loud and angry, she said, they'll make you the story. Go in with facts, and they become the story. There was also a personal consideration I couldn't ignore. We have a son, Luke, 9 years old. He was the heart of everything. I didn't want him to grow up in a courtroom saga with TV cameras and headlines. He deserved as normal a life as possible until the day we had to rip the bandage off. I worked that into the plan: delay public exposure until the case was airtight and the child could be protected. That was another reason for patience. Months of quiet work built up like a reservoir. Each document I gathered, each receipt I photocopied, was added to a ring binder labeled in a way that would make me smile later, the exhibit. When I showed Priya the first draft, she nodded and said, if we align the bank records with the recordings and the receipts, and we can demonstrate pattern and intent, this will look very bad for them. That was the legal side. There was the human side, too. I needed allies who would stand with me. Betrayal isolates people by design. The cheaters want you alone because unity reveals patterns. So I reached out, carefully, to 2 old friends and to a woman in our neighborhood who ran a small daycare and had watched Luke after school. I didn't tell them everything. I simply told them I needed people who would be willing to testify to seeing certain behaviors, nights Ethan arriving late and leaving early, Claire's sudden absences, the times Luke was picked up by a man I didn't recognize. They agreed, their faces tightening with the sort of empathy that turns into quiet support. One wrench came from an unexpected corner. My own pride. Some nights, I'd imagine the public spectacle, Claire's face when the truth came out, Ethan's posture crumbling. I'd imagine the satisfaction of walking into the courtroom and watching them squirm. And then I'd picture Luke asking why his parents were fighting, why there were whispers at school. The sweetness of revenge has a bitter aftertaste, it's not purely pleasure. The moral calculus of good and harm gets messy. So I scheduled everything around Luke. I took him to soccer practice, to his piano lessons, and kept the house warm. I made sure he ate dinner at the table. The more normal I could keep our family life public, the less leverage the cheaters had in the court of neighborhood opinion. Up to that point, the plan had gone according to what a man could control. But people are unpredictable. There are always leaks, and one came when I nearly lost everything. One night, Claire caught me going through a drawer. Not the phone, one of the small kitchen drawers where I kept the receipts I'd printed. She walked in and the look on her face was something I recognized now, the raw, naked fear of a gambler who's just been seen counting chips. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She stood there like a woman who'd been unmasked in a moment she hadn't prepared for. For a second I saw something that wasn't hate in her eyes, surprise, maybe a flicker of regret, then the practiced deflection. "What are you doing?" she asked, steady, control returning. I smiled, because you learn to keep your face still in these moments. "Looking for a pen," I lied. "Want to sign something?" She watched me for a long beat and then left the kitchen, closing the door softly. That nocturne of silence told me one thing: my pattern had been noticed. The risk had risen. After that night I tightened the security around the evidence. I moved copies of the files to an off-site locker. I encrypted the cloud files further. I changed passwords. I made sure my calls to Aaron and Priya used secure lines. Paranoia is not cowardice when the stakes are this high, it is necessary caution. We pressed on. Priya drafted a letter that would, when the time came, request the immediate preservation of records from the vendors and demand a temporary freeze on certain accounts pending an accounting. Aaron refined the timeline to an incontrovertible hour-by-hour thread. Laura continued watching Ethan. I kept my life pleasant and my face blank. And then, in the lull between seasons, a mistake from them finally gave me the opening I'd been waiting for. Ethan, in a moment of what I can only call hubris, used his personal card to make a large purchase at a luxury retailer and then had Claire have their assistant invoice it back to the marketing vendor to make it look like a legitimate promotional expense. The assistant, however, was sloppy. She reused a template and addressed the invoice to the wrong company name. The invoice went to an old vendor who, when questioned, asked for proof of delivery. A delivery driver, a man with no patience for phantom invoices, tracked down the package and confirmed the goods were addressed to Ethan's downtown apartment, not the boutique warehouse. That sequence of sloppiness was audio to us. I sat with Aaron as he drew arrows between transactions and receipts. When you combine a recording of a delivery driver's voicemail, a trail of bank transfers, an assistant's mistaken template, and a credit card statement, you're no longer in the realm of suspicion, you're in the arena of proof. That's where part 2 must end, with the neat little moment where arrogance yields a mistake, and a private ledger begins to look like a public case. We had the thread, and once you have one thread you can start to unravel fabric. In part 3, I'll take you into the slow unspooling, the legal maneuvers, the way we set the trap so they would step into it, and the hour when their private life become public record. Before I close, one small thing: if you had evidence like this, would you go straight to the police, or would you build a civil case first? Tell me one word in the comments: police or court. I read every line, and every one helps me measure what people think is right. I didn't explode. I didn't demand answers. I just let Claire and Mark keep weaving their web while I pretended to be the oblivious, overworked husband. Inside, though, every smile I faked was another brick in the wall I was quietly building around them. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence, it was waiting. Every night I came home, they tested my patience more. Claire started working late, her phone always flipped upside down on the counter. Mark texted me casually about golf trips while secretly transferring money from our joint account to cover Claire's little shopping sprees. They thought I was blind. But what they didn't realize was that I'd already hired a private investigator. Within 2 weeks, I had pictures, grainy but clear, of the two of them together. Restaurants. Hotel lobbies. Even my own car parked in the background of one shot. My car. And still, I didn't confront them. Not yet. I wanted them to get comfortable, to think they'd won. Because the deeper they sank into their scheme, the harder it would be for them to climb out when I pulled the floor out from under them. I spent late nights at my desk, combing through bank records. That's when I noticed the transfers, small at first, but steady. Claire had convinced me to set up an account for household savings. Turns out, the household she meant didn't include me. By the time I caught on, almost $80,000 had been rerouted. I copied everything: screenshots, statements, timestamps. My folder of evidence was growing fat. But the real knife twist came one Friday night. I got home early, hoping to catch Claire before she could spin one of her meetings. Instead, I found her laptop open on the dining table. She must have stepped out for a call. And there it was, a document titled New Beginnings. A drafted lease agreement, not in my name, but in hers and Mark's. They were planning to move in together. Not after telling me. Not after a clean break. No. Their plan was to drain me first, then vanish into their shiny new life. I shut the laptop quietly and sat in the dark until Claire came back in. She looked startled, like a thief caught mid-act. But I just smiled, kissed her cheek, and asked about dinner. She relaxed instantly, not knowing I had just seen the blueprint of my betrayal. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The rage was there, pulsing, but beneath it something stronger: resolve. If she thought she could erase me from my own life, she had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't going to just survive this. I was going to end it on my terms. Backhand index pointing right, and here's where I'll pause, because the trap I was building for them? It wasn't just financial. It was personal. Stay tuned, because in the next part, you'll see exactly how I turned their new beginning into their worst nightmare. Betrayal doesn't always explode. Sometimes it erodes. It starts as a hairline crack in a foundation, a whisper under a floorboard, a small damp spot behind drywall. And because it's quiet, people miss the way the house shifts, until one morning the door sticks and you realize the whole frame has warped. That's what happened after I found the lease. I didn't fling it around or shout. I folded the printed agreement, put it in the folder with the bank transfers and voicemail recordings, and I walked out the next morning like a man whose life was unchanged. But the thin, corrosive work had already started, and the first signs of the fallout didn't come from Claire or Ethan. They came from the people we thought would stay the same. It began at my son's school. Luke came home one afternoon with a note from his teacher. Some of the children asked about their parents. If there's anything you want us to know to support Luke, please call. A simple, well-meaning message, but the implication was unmistakable. Kids hear things. Kids repeat things. And when your life has a leak, it shows up where you least want it, on a tiny desk with crayon marks. I called the teacher and explained as much as I could, age-appropriate, minimal. She was kind. She didn't push. Still, the note had traveled. A neighbor saw me sign a permission slip at the soccer field. A woman who used to smile at Claire in the lobby started to look past her now with a small, hard expression that said she'd been asked for answers she didn't like. Rumors, tiny, insidious, are how social structures adjust. People pivot away from the man who's suddenly complicated. They whisper about privacy and family matters, and in that whisper is judgment. I felt it most at the hardware store, of all places, when the owner, someone who knew me before I had a company car, hesitated when I offered to pay for a load of timber. He looked at me politely but then tapped his card machine with a small, embarrassed shrug. He wouldn't be the only one. Claire felt it too, though she tried to pretend otherwise. Her friends who used to call for brunch started canceling. Invitations I'd once received for Saturday poker games stopped arriving. People aren't cruel by nature, they're protective of their own tidy lives. When a life starts to smell of scandal, the most comfortable people in a community move away from it. Where they moved away, she faltered. Her smile became slightly brittle, it had the flex of a manufactured thing, not the easy curve I'd fallen in love with. She pasted new filters on her social photos, posted images of a happy family, of Luke at a birthday party, of me at an awards night for work. But the filters don't fix ledger lines. Ethan, on the other hand, reacted with something uglier, anger that masqueraded as entitlement. He'd toyed with the idea that nothing would touch him because he was charming, because he could talk a room into any posture. When the investors pulled back and the vendors started asking for receipts, his charm curdled into threats. He left messages on my phone, harsh, stupid things that made me glad our legal team had copies. Those messages were useful. They helped show intent. Arrogance that becomes desperation is both a motive and an admission. When a man is used to getting his way by smiling, the first time he can't by silence, he lashes out. That's the moment his mask slips. Meanwhile, my allies began to make themselves known, not in loud proclamations, but in small, practical ways. The contractor I'd used for years stepped up and brought us copies of unpaid invoices. A junior accountant who'd been too timid before handed over emails that showed Claire's assistant forwarding invoices with curious memo lines. The daycare director agreed, quietly, to confirm dates when I needed someone to say, Luke stayed here that afternoon. People who had been paid with smiles and promises finally had real reason to speak. Church members who had once greeted Claire with warmth now asked her gentle, pointed questions about charity drives and donations. People treat charity like a test of character. A sudden drought there is a crimson flag. I watched it happen, invitations withdrawn, congratulatory messages left unanswered, group texts that had once been full of gossip now conspicuously silent. Social capital evaporates faster than financial capital, and it hurts differently because it's public. The harder, slower damage came from business relationships. A distributor we'd used for 10 years called my office and asked whether the recent payment delays were temporary. We arranged a conference call, and the man on the other end was blunt. He'd been told Claire and Ethan were steering the ship, but he also had a ledger that didn't match what he'd been promised. He asked for clarification, politely and precisely, and then asked for documentation. When you start needing to produce documentation for things you've billed away, the math gets unpleasant. At first, Claire tried to answer these calls. She'd patch them with excuses about reinvesting and pivoting. But the more she met the scrutiny, the thinner her answers sounded, and the more people began to pry deeper. People start to ask hard questions when soft ones are avoided. There was a particularly bitter scene one evening at a neighborhood fundraiser. I'd agreed, quietly, to attend. It seemed kinder, and controls the optics. Claire arrived with Ethan on her arm, both of them wearing the same practiced smiles. They stood under the string lights, people mingling around them, the band playing a lazy cover of something we used to love. A woman I used to consider a friend pulled me aside. "David," she said quietly, "I've been meaning to ask, do you know about those invoices at the gallery? They said the boutique had a delivery that never showed." Her voice was small but edged with something I recognized, the polite fury of a person who feels used. Before I could answer, Ethan laughed loudly and cut across the conversation, making a joke about accounting oversights. His laugh was too loud, it tugged a few heads. The whispered conversations around us seemed to slow to a stop. Claire's face paled imperceptibly. Later, someone left a note at our front door, a polite, anonymous card that said, "Wishing the Lawsons all the best. Family first." The sentiment was a thin veneer. It was support with one hand and distance with the other. That night, I stood by the window watching people walk by, their silhouettes softened by street lamps. I imagined the long game, how easy it is to be lonely in public, how quickly a life's narrative can be rewritten by the people you trusted to protect it. That alone steel-tempered me. Luke noticed the shift. Children are as perceptive as they are resilient. One afternoon, after clabbered laughter on the way home from piano lessons, he asked me point-blank, "Is Mommy and Ethan going to move away?" His eyes were small, worried, the reasonable fear of a child sensing the tremor of an earthquake without knowing the structural cause. What do you say to that? How do you explain the difference between adult betrayal and a child's need for a bedtime story? I told him what was true and age-appropriate. Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, but I will always be here, buddy. We're okay. He nodded, like children do, and went to build a fort with cushions. Later that night, after he was asleep, I sat with my back to the kitchen table and let my face feel whatever it needed to, rage, hurt, the cold tinge of determination. Protecting him wasn't just sentimental. In a legal fight, a child can become a pawn. I kept his routine sacrosanct: school, soccer, piano, sleepovers with grandparents. The more normal his life looked, the less room Claire and Ethan had to paint me as unstable or unfit. The local press started to nibble. An anonymous tip about unusual vendor payments became a short, discreet story about financial irregularities in a local boutique. Journalists aren't vultures, they're professionals, but they also follow trails. The piece didn't name names, but people in our neighborhood read it and began to look differently at the couple who'd suddenly been everywhere on Instagram. That's when Claire's social scaffolding began to crumble. Her boutique's charming pop-up events had been a string of evenings with photographs and champagne. Sponsors who once bragged about co-hosting pulled back when a vendor mentioned overdue invoices. Invitations dried up. The boutique's Instagram remained glossy, but comments dwindled. People begin to equate glossy facades with fragile foundations. Ethan's world shifted too, less dramatically, harder. Friends he'd used to call for poker nights started accepting invitations less often. The men he'd once dined with at the club now found reasons to be out of town. You can lose cash and come back, you lose a network and you start to find your options narrowing. It all fed the legal picture, quietly and inexorably. Banks receive more than math, they register reputational risk. Investors pay attention to social signals. Vendors stop offering credit lines when the tables say they've been burned. That's how a personal betrayal translates into professional collapse. Social friction becomes fiscal pressure, and fiscal pressure becomes exposure. There was a moment that hit me like an old scar reopening. One afternoon a delivery driver, an external witness we'd cultivated months earlier, called to say he'd been subpoenaed by a corporate attorney in the city who was doing routine queries. His voice was flat, tired. They asked if the package went to Ethan's apartment, he told me. I told them yes. The driver's small confession mattered far more than it should have, another data point, another nail. Ethan didn't handle any of this well. In a rage, he posted a video on social media defending our family, angrily denouncing anyone who'd suggest he'd done anything wrong. It was desperate and performative. He tried to take back the narrative with volume and fury. People watched that video, some nodding with sympathy, most watching for the next twist. When your defense is outrage rather than evidence, you look like a man trying to hide something. At home, the least dramatic but most devastating fallout was between Claire and the woman who used to be her closest friend, someone who'd known her before any of the boutique's success. That friend called one evening. You could hear the sorrow in her voice as she said, "See, I can't stand with you on this. I can't. Not if you've been doing this to David." For a person who relied on social alliances to prop up a fragile business, the loss of a single confidant is a reverberant blow. It strips away the "we're in this together" posture and leaves the gambit exposed as what it was, a calculated selfishness. All this fallout didn't solve my problem at once. But it did what I wanted it to do: it eroded their options. It tightened the room. Claire's cash flow slowed because vendors wanted invoices paid. Ethan's friends avoided loans and introductions. The public was beginning to notice a pattern rather than an isolated scandal. And when the pattern is visible, the law has better footing. I kept my face public-friendly, picked Luke up from school, practiced piano scales with him, and watched Claire's composure fray like an old rope. I let the rumor mill do the part that felt merciless but necessary. Once people suspect, they act less as a mob and more as a marketplace of consequences. Then, on a drizzly Tuesday evening, a thick envelope arrived at our door. It wasn't addressed to Claire. It had my name on it. The county clerk had sent notice that a creditor had filed to place a lien against one of the boutique's assets, a vendor seeking payment. A lien is a simple, ugly thing. It creates public paper that says, someone owes money and it hasn't been paid. Once that document goes on record, you can't easily pretend the problem is a rumor. Claire opened the letter with hands that trembled. Ethan tried to blame an assistant. He snapped at her, then softened in a way that made the room feel like broken glass. Luke, coming in from school, asked if everything was okay. I said the honest thing: we'll handle it. Then I made a call to Priya, our attorney, and asked her to draft a preservation order for our evidence. The legal work would start to overlap with the social work. That's where stories collapse into cases. There are moral costs to this kind of strategy. I lost people who might never come back even after the truth was known. Friends I'd assumed would stand at my side watched in silence and later told me they didn't want to get involved. Some of those people reached out months later with polite messages of support, but it was never the same. This is one of those bitter lessons life gives you. The people who cheer loudest when things go well are often the quietest when things need courage. For Claire and Ethan, the fallout was accelerating. For Luke, it was a confusing season of too many adults whispering in corners. For me, it was a painful calculus: expose them now when the damage to my son's routine would be smaller, or wait until the legal case was fully ready and risk another leak. I chose to balance both, keep the home as normal as possible, and let the legal work proceed, step by quiet step. At night, sometimes I found Claire awake in the kitchen, staring at the fridge like it held answers. We didn't speak. The house had become a roomful of ghosts: our life before, our life now, our life afterward. There's a loneliness that exists when you share a roof and not a heart. You can feel the person beside you breathe and still sense miles between you. I tightened the final piece of the net that week. Priya had confirmed she could file for temporary injunctive relief to stop further transfers and could request immediate preservation of all company records. The bank was cooperative. Banks are self-interested, and the hint of a scandal makes them cautious. Vendors were willing to produce statements and affidavits. I had the recordings. I had the receipts. I had witnesses who would speak. The final move would be public, a strategic, controlled exposure in court coupled with a tidy packet for local press that emphasized facts, not gossip. I wanted clarity more than spectacle. I wanted the ledger to speak. But before the public thing happened, there was one more private domino to tip. A man is rarely felled by the law alone, often it is the loss of social oxygen, friends, clients, and the simple credence that allows you to continue, that makes a fall complete. I'd watched the social oxygen thin around them, the law would do the rest. I arranged one last meeting with an investor who'd been sitting on the fence. He agreed to show up to the hearing if he saw clear evidence. He wanted to be sure his name wouldn't be tangled in a mess if he committed capital. As the rain let up and the air smelled like wet pavement and fresh starts, I sat at the kitchen table and placed the folder of evidence where I could see it. It was heavy in my hand, not because of the paper, but because of the responsibility. There's a cruelty to truth, and I had to wield it without cruelty to the innocent. One more thing, a subtle note for you who are following: if you were in my place, would you prefer the drama of a public reveal or the quiet certainty of a legal resolution? Type one word, public or private. I read every comment. The next part is the final act, the court hearing, the press, the unspooling of their plan into the light, and the moment I watched two people who thought themselves clever realize the cost of their choices. That's where the story closes, and where I finally decide what to keep and what to burn. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and dust, the kind of place where secrets lose their shadows and truth takes on weight. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped, outwardly calm but with every nerve taut like a drawn bowstring. Across from me sat Claire and Ethan, my wife and my so-called friend, two people who once held my trust in their hands and crushed it without hesitation. The judge entered, and the room stood. When we sat again, my lawyer leaned close, whispering, "Today is where it all lands, David. Breathe." But I wasn't here for air. I was here for blood, figuratively, of course. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. Forged documents transferring assets. Secret accounts tied back to Ethan. Emails where Claire spoke of me in cold, transactional terms: "Once David is out of the picture, we'll have it all." Each revelation was another nail in their coffin, hammered home in full view of the court. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her polished composure cracking at the edges. Ethan tried to mask his nerves with a smirk, but even from across the room, I could see the sweat staining his collar. And then came my turn. I took the stand. The lawyer asked me to explain what had happened in my own words. My voice didn't shake. I spoke of the nights I stayed awake, piecing together the trail of betrayal. Of the sacrifices I had made, working overtime, delaying my own dreams, pouring everything into a future I thought we shared. I described how Claire, the woman I'd loved since I was young, conspired with the man I once called a brother. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Even the court reporters' keys seemed to hesitate as I said, "They didn't just steal money. They stole years. They stole trust." And when I uncovered the truth, I made a choice. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg. I would build a case so solid that when this day came, they would have nowhere to run. When I stepped down, the weight shifted. The defense tried to spin their story. Ethan claimed financial stress, Claire pleaded confusion, desperation, a moment of weakness. But their words fell flat against the mountain of proof. The judge's ruling was swift. Assets returned. Fraud charges filed. Both of them held accountable, stripped of the power they thought they had stolen from me. But here's the thing, the legal victory wasn't the true revenge. That came afterward. Because the press was there. Reporters who ate up every detail of the power couple's collapse and the treachery of a family friend. By the next morning, their faces were plastered across headlines. Affair and fraud scheme uncovered. Community figures exposed in betrayal scandal. Claire lost her reputation. Ethan lost his business. They didn't just lose me, they lost the image they had built of themselves. And me? I walked out of that courthouse lighter than I had felt in years. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had chosen myself. I burned the remnants of the life we shared, photographs, letters, mementos that no longer meant anything. But I kept the lesson. Betrayal carves deep scars, but it also hardens resolve. They thought they had buried me. Instead, they sharpened me. And as I stood outside the courthouse with the cameras flashing, I allowed myself one final thought. Revenge wasn't the point. Justice was. But damn if it didn't feel sweet to watch them finally choke on the ashes of their own greed. Backhand index pointing right. Tell me this, if the people closest to you tried to erase you for their gain, would you fight back in silence until the hammer dropped, or would you confront them immediately? Let me know below. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because the sweetest revenge is always worth waiting for.